Good afternoon. This is the Hinckley Institute Forum. We are happy to have you join us, whether it's live or you're watching this at a later date. This is the Hinckley Institute Preserving Democracy in a Pandemic, a conversation with Utah's election officials. And we're excited to have an exciting group of individuals who are experts in their fields on our panel. By brief way of introduction, the reason why this forum is so important is because unless you're living in a cave, you cannot say this is one of the most exciting political years in history. In fact, at least the way I define it, it's the year of three Ps: pandemic, partnership, and protests. And those elements are really driving what is happening in our discussions, but it's also impacting the way that we vote. When you think about it, the mail-in voting and the drive-by voting, things like that have become major issues of national concern across the country. As we saw what's happening in Georgia and Pennsylvania, there's been all sorts of problems. But what's been interesting, as usual, here in Utah, we do things the Utah way. And we do mail-in balloting, and as you'll hear quite a bit of it here, and it works well. And it's been going about quite well, but also we have to adapt to the pandemic. And so one of the questions we're going to address today is mail-in balloting a good process? Is it a successful process in Utah? What changes can we expect? Then we'll also talk about the problems with mail-in balloting. Is it truly a problematic thing, or is that something that just partisan hype? Because there was a Washington Post article very recently that said that 0.001% in a study about mail-in ballots were invalid. So this is a topic of concern, not just for the primary election, but going into the general election and possibly future elections, because we believe that mail-in balloting in Utah is probably here to stay unless there's a change, but it also provides a lot of opportunities. So with us today is we have Ricky Hatch, who is the Weber County Clerk Auditor. We have Amelia Powers Gardner, who is the Utah County Clerk Auditor, Justin Lee, State Elections Director, and Sherry Swenson, Salt Lake County Clerk. And this will be an open mic. We'll encourage participation, but we're also encouraging questions from the audience. Again, this is with the Hinckley Institute. If you're interested in the Hinckley Institute, please log on to their wonderful website. The Hinckley Institute does a great deal of service, not only just to students, but to the community as a whole, to really promote all the elements of democracy. So let's start off with a brief explanation of what is voting by mail. Who would like to go with that? Justin?
Yeah, I will take that one. No one else seemed to want it. So vote by mail, let me do a brief history in Utah. We've been doing vote by mail really since 2012. And before that, which I'll come back to in just one second, but there was a law passed in 2012, which allowed any county to run their election by mail. And since 2012, we've had new counties add on every year until in 2020, we finally got every single county who is running their election primarily by mail. So this is something we've been doing for several years. Some counties have been doing it for 8 years, 6 years, 4 years, depending on the county. And even prior to that, we had absentee voting. And Utah is a no-fault absentee state where anybody can request an absentee ballot. So as far as actually sending ballots through the mail, we've been doing this for a very long time.
Great. I was one of those curmudgeons who, when we started to expand voting mail, says, no, I'm going to go to that polling place because that is what democracy is about. None of this. I think 2 years ago, I succumbed because it's easy and you guys made the process. But what are the advantages of vote by mail? Why is it picked up and why is it successful? Sherry, do you want to since you're the clerk for the largest county in the state, what are your thoughts?
Well, for one thing, we mail a ballot to every active registered voter who's eligible to vote in that election. And we mail the ballot at least 3 weeks before the election. It gives the voters time to review the candidates and if there's a proposition, a constitutional amendment, time to review the candidates and the issues and make more knowledgeable decisions on how they want to cast their vote. Unlike if they show up at an in-person location and all of a sudden they see an issue on the ballot and they're not prepared, this gives them time to prepare. And I think that's one of the best reasons for vote by mail, and not to mention the convenience to mail the ballot and have the voter receive the ballot and be able to cast that ballot at their home, put it back in the mail or drop it in a ballot drop box and just have that convenience.
Anybody else want to opine on the beauties of mail-in balloting?
Well,
Millie?
in Utah County, I think we were the last county of those of us here in the forum to adopt it, and it was only adopted in 2017. And I think we've seen an uptick in voter participation because of it. So we have more citizens in Utah County voting now than we did in 2016 because of the vote by mail implementation. And every year that since then, so 2017, 2018, 2019, we've seen that voter participation go up and more people happy with vote by mail.
And I have read I've read studies that show it goes up a fair amount in municipal races, and then in the general races it goes up less, but it does go up. So, Mr. Hatch, please explain to those watching why dead people and non-citizens will not be voting by mail this year.
You bet, happy to do so. So, first off, the key when you're doing vote by mail, it's very important to have a good, clean database, the voter registration database. When we started in Weber County back in 2013 and we mailed out our ballots, over 15% of those ballots came back undeliverable, which was a huge amount. And we have worked and scrubbed that database because it changes daily. And now when we mail them out, only 1.5% come back undeliverable. One key thing is to make sure when you're talking about people who've passed away, our database gets updated. We have a link with the Department of Vital Statistics through the State Health Department. And when anyone passes away in Utah, they are notified, that department, there's a death certificate created and that department's notified, and they provide that information to us at the state level, and then the voter registration database is updated. In addition to that, many counties will also look at their obituaries in the paper just to make sure nothing got missed. So we're pretty careful to make sure if someone has passed on, they are inactivated and removed from the voter database, so they don't even receive a ballot. As far as people who aren't citizens, the other verification that we like to do with our voter registration database is when a voter registers, we actually go and confirm their driver's license number with the state driver's license division, and we confirm the social security number. And we do that in detail with every voter to make sure that they qualify. If you'll remember last time you got your driver's license updated, you probably had to provide some pretty significant documentation to prove that you were a resident of Utah and that you were a citizen. And that's one of the key controls to help make sure that only citizens are allowed ballots and are provided and are able to vote.
Okay, so we're not expecting a block of voters from the cemeteries this time around mailing in their ballots.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think it's important to point out that when you don't do vote by mail, a lot of times that maintenance on that voter registration database doesn't happen because it's not as high of a security risk. They say, well, if you're dead, you're not showing up at the polling location and showing your ID. So the administrators don't take nearly as much of an effort to clean that database. When we do vote by mail, we do, because we're proactively mailing a ballot. That's about $1 to $2 per voter. And if you have 30,000 people that are dead on your voter rolls, you're spending like $60,000 to send them ballots. So we have a financial incentive to update that. And it really makes it so that we spend more time updating and cleaning our voter database.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. Well, how do you know that the ballot was returned by the actual voter and not by the spouse or the neighbor or somebody else?
Well, I'll take that if I could. We actually compare the signature for every ballot returned. On the return envelope, there's an affidavit signed by the voter, and we compare that to the signature that we have on file for that registered voter. And if it doesn't match, we send that voter what we call a cure letter. We give them an opportunity to cure that ballot so that it can be counted. But we have a huge process. It's very labor intensive to make sure that the signature on that return ballot affidavit matches the signature we have on record for that voter.
I've got a fun story on that. We, just like the other counties, we check every single signature, and we do 2 rounds. Round one is pretty easy. you go through and you're getting all the matches. Well, round 2 is all the ones that on first pass didn't match. And we were going through, and on round 2, on second pass, we have access to more signatures. We can do up to 5 signatures in our county. So we're looking at your voter registration, but we're also looking at your DMV. And the other thing we have access to is we can look at the signature for every voter in your household. And I had one that we went through, didn't match. Second pass, we checked the DMV signature, didn't match. So we pull up every voter in their household. And the last name was a spitting match for the wife. I mean, exactly for the wife. So we call her up and we call and we say, hey, so we see that you signed your husband's ballot. She said, oh yeah, he told me I could. Okay, that's a felony. It's voter fraud. We're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you didn't know it was a felony and that you thought it was okay because he told you it was. You still can't do that. You can't sign for missionaries. You can't sign for kids in college. You can't sign for your spouse, even if he's out of town. And we're going to mark your voter file to show that we've warned you for this. In the future, if we find you've signed other people's ballots again, we will have to turn your information over to the FBI for voter fraud. But we're not going to this time. I've never had a repeat person.
Wow. Well, what, can someone vote twice by using the system? Does that also prevent people from voting twice?
That's another great control that we have. And the nice thing is Utah has a statewide voter registration database, so we are all linked. And when a voter returns their envelope, the very first thing that county clerks do is we scan. There's a barcode on the outside of that envelope. We scan that, and that immediately updates this statewide voter registration database as we've received a ballot. Now, if I tried to be cute as a voter and I waited until I went in and voted in person, and then hurried and dropped my ballot in a drop box 10 minutes later, the system would, when they went to scan that envelope, the system would say, hey, hang on a sec. This person voted in person just today. And so we're going to stop that. And at that point, that kicks it off to another research team, then goes and looks and says, okay, this shows voted twice, or they attempted to vote twice. Let's take a look. So it's a great control. We've had similar stories to what Amelia said, working with the FBI for people who have turned in their voter their envelope into Dropbox and voted in person on the exact same day, and they got a visit from the FBI.
When that happens, most of the time, it's an old lady who voted with her envelope, and then her neighbor came and said, hey, we're going to the polls. Do you want to come? And she completely forgot she already mailed in her ballot, and she shows up at the polls with her neighbor. That's usually what it is. But when it's not, we do call the FBI.
Wow. I mean, on one hand, you are giving me all sorts of confidence and warm feeling in the system, but you're taking away great stories about the armies of the dead coming to vote. So, well, bless you for everything you're doing. Some of the questions, though, are: does this? What do you do to preserve people's right of a secret ballot? Because when they drop it, when they go to vote in person, they're dropping it in a box. But here you're sending it. Explain the system there that you're preserving a cherished right of secret ballot in this country.
Well, in Salt Lake County, when a ballot is returned, it's run through a big piece of machinery. We call it a GILIS, and it logs in, as Ricky explained, there's a barcode on the return ballot envelope. It logs in that we've received that ballot. Then it goes through a team. They pull the tab covering the signature on the envelope, and then it goes back through a GILIS. It takes a picture of that signature so we can use that on a digital screen, and it pulls up the signature we have on record for that voter. And then it goes to another machine. We call it OPEX. It slices open, it's like an assembly line. Stack of ballots put in this machine, slices open the envelope, and then someone at that machine is quickly removing the security sleeve that contains the folded ballot. The envelope with any identifier is dropped down into a bin. And now all the person removing that has in their hand is the security sleeve with a folded ballot in it. There is no way that they can correlate that to the individual voter.
Wow.
And so we use an Agilis and we use an OPEX, the same as Salt Lake County. And when the OPEX opens the ballot, it's got suction cups. And when it opens that ballot, it opens the envelope like this. And as you extract that ballot, the suction cups are covering whose ballot it was. And as you pull out that folded ballot, you can't see how they voted. And then you're putting those in a stack to a side. On top of that, none of these processes are ever done with just a single person in the ballot center. They're done with multiple people in the ballot center. And we now have cameras. We have cameras that are recording data the whole time. So and they're pointed at every one of these machines. So you've got a room full of people, and we're doing this incredibly quickly. Our machines are covering this data, and we've recorded all of it. So we've got several fail-safes. Ricky and I are both not only clerks, but auditors as well. And when you talk about the fraud triangle, one of the things that is part of that fraud triangle is opportunity. If you want to reduce fraud, you take away people's opportunity to commit fraud. I look at this the same way when I run elections. I'm going to take away every opportunity that someone has to try and violate someone's right to a secret ballot, and I'm going to remove those opportunities. And then on top of that, we record everything. So it's really, when you come in, and I would encourage you to come in and see how your county clerks do this. If you come in and you see how we do this, then I think you'll see the confidence level that we've put in many levels of fail-safes for you.
Great.
And I think that's important. What Amelia just brought up is, one of the other things is the law allows for people to come watch the process. The law allows for watchers, and our county clerks are very good about that. If someone, don't take our word for it. If you really want to come see it, the county clerks are very good about letting people come watch. One, because the law requires it. It's another fail-safe. And two, they really want people to come see this and see that it works well. So definitely reach out to the county clerk and go. I've seen Weber, Utah, and Salt Lake counties processes, and several in some of the smaller counties as well. Have gone and personally watched them to see how it's working and to see if there's any holes, and they do a very good job.
Great. Thank you for that. So does vote by mail, does that favor one party? Because that's been one of the accusations. And it's interesting we're holding this in Utah because the accusation is that it's something that the blue states want to do. But here we are in a red state that has been using vote by mail. And so I'd be curious to discuss experience with all of you. Does it favor one party over another?
Utah County is heavily Republican, and it increased our voter turnout, which therefore increases our Republican voter turnout. And I don't think it favors one party. I think if you have more Democrats in your county, then more Democrats are going to vote. If you have more Republicans in your county, more Republicans are going to vote. I think it just causes more voters. And
then Ricky, you had a study from Stanford that talked about this, right?
Yeah, Stanford, I'm not sure exactly when they started this study, but they released their report in March of this year. And the study showed that there was no aid to one party or the other than what Amelia talked about. If one party is dominant, that party is going to benefit because of the higher turnout.
And Justin, I know that you've done some analysis on this too.
Yeah, we haven't seen anything that indicates it helps one party over another. One example that I think I can point to, not completely scientific, just sort of anecdotal, is the 4th Congressional District has been a very competitive district ever since it was created. If you look at 2016, Salt Lake County was vote by mail. Utah County was not vote by mail. That year with Salt Lake County, which leans a little more Democratic than Utah County, the Republican won in the 4th Congressional District. In 2018, Utah County came online doing vote by mail. And if you really thought vote by mail was going to help one party over another, you'd expect that the Republican wins in 2018 with Utah County coming on board. That's not what happened. The Democrat won in 2018. So I think that's one example we can see, at least here in Utah, where one county doing vote by mail versus another did not change the outcome from a partisan perspective.
Thank you. So we have a primary coming up on June 30th. Maybe Sherry and some of the others, do you mind talking about what the requirements are in terms of if someone wants to vote by mail or if they want to do the in-person option?
So we mailed ballots to, because it's a partisan primary, along with some nonpartisan local school board contests, we mailed ballots to people who in the respective parties for which they had a primary that applied to their district. So it's been a little confusing to unaffiliated voters who received a nonpartisan ballot and then since then updated their party affiliation. And immediately when we had ordered a ballot for a partisan primary, that nonpartisan ballot was canceled or spoiled, as we call it in our system. And it's in Vista. We spoiled that ballot. And then when they updated their party, we mailed them a party ballot according to which party they had affiliated with, for the most part, the Republican Party ballot. So sometimes in this situation, they had received two ballots. The first one had been spoiled. We've received a lot of emails and they've been asking, you know, I got this nonpartisan ballot. Did my party affiliation go through? And we're telling them, yes, that ballot's been spoiled. Do not return it. And your Republican ballot, which is usually the case, is on the way. So for this election, one of the things that we are doing is we were given, because of the legislative law change, if we as a county wanted to offer something to voters on election day, because of COVID, they were trying to make it safer. They eliminated in-person early voting and said, if we want to do something on election day, it has to be drive up. So drive up is going to be not putting in a machine in their car and having them vote. It's going to be issuing a ballot packet to individuals who are eligible to receive a ballot packet, but didn't receive one. So it's going to be, we don't want to call it drive up voting. It isn't drive up voting. It's drive up and get a ballot packet if you were eligible to receive a ballot, but did not get one. And we have opted to do that in Salt Lake County along with 6 other counties. And it is getting a little confusing because people keep calling it drive up voting. I was on the Dave and Debbie show this morning and they said, oh, what's this about drive up voting? And I'm like, no, it isn't drive up voting. We will give them a packet that is much like the vote by mail packet that they received, and we'll tell them to proceed, vote the ballot, drop it in a drop box. So they have to be a registered voter. There will be no same day registration. That was eliminated in the updated legislation. And so it's a little bit of a change from the way things have been done in the past for this election because of COVID.
Yeah.
So it's maybe someone could talk to this also. There's a postmark requirement that's unique. Maybe talk about some of the other challenges you're facing.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So this election is going to be a little different. You can postmark your ballot on election day. Previously, it needed to be postmarked the day before elections. So in March, for the Super Tuesday or last year, you had to postmark your ballot the day before the election. This year, you can postmark your ballot the day of the election. Now, there's one thing I want people to realize. If you drop your ballot in the mail at 7 p.m. on election day, it's probably not going to get postmarked on election day. There's a good chance it might not get postmarked until the next day. So I would recommend that you get your ballot in the day before anyway, or if you do it that morning. But if you're waiting until 7 p.m. and polls close at 8 p.m., you're not getting that postmarked. That could be a problem. So keep that in mind. And right now in November, it will go back to the day before. That could change. There is legislation pending right now in the legislature to change that so that it's permanently on election day. Once again, even if that gets changed, keep in mind the postmark may not happen if you drop your ballot. However, ballot drop boxes are open until 8 p.m. on election day. So I would encourage people to utilize that ballot drop box and just take away the confusion and the risk of trying to get your ballot postmarked on election day. That's one change. Another one, like Sherry said, there is no same-day voter registration. Now, an unaffiliated voter can show up at a drive-through location and change their party affiliation and receive a ballot packet. Or if you've moved recently, you can show up and change your address and receive a ballot packet. But if you are affiliated with a party, if you're a Green Party member and you wanted a Democrat ballot, you're not going to be able to change party affiliation. If you're a Democrat and you want a Republican ballot, or a Constitution Party and you want a Republican ballot, you're not going to be able to change party affiliation. So your best bet is, if you want to do that, right now is the 17th. You have until the 19th. You have 2 days, if you're listening live, to change your party affiliation, but you can change your address. So little confusing. That's frustrating for Sherry and Ricky and myself. Anytime that there's legislation that can confuse voters, it's frustrating for us, but we're doing the best we can to accommodate as many voters as we can. And I think the last thing that I want to mention is these drive-through locations. Keep in mind, it's only 7 counties: Weber, Davis, Salt Lake, Utah, Box Elder, Tooele, and Iron County. That's it. If you're in any of the other counties, you can't change party affiliation, you can't change your address. If you didn't get a ballot in the mail, contact your county clerk immediately.
Well, thank you. In case you don't know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And for political and history geeks like me, I read about the last time we had a pandemic, it was 1918. It was the middle of a congressional election. It was fascinating, both here in Utah and across the country, trying to get people to vote, but they didn't have the mail-in option. So they're trying to get people to show up to polls. And the second wave, which was the most deadliest wave of the 1918 flu, or otherwise known as the Spanish flu. So they were trying to get people to vote. So it was very interesting. Some of the tactics were the same used by candidates today. But let's talk a little bit what voting in a pandemic means to you. Okay, we've talked about the mail-in balloting, but you're going to get all these ballots. What are you going to do with these ballots, especially with all the scare that's been going around, how long the virus stays and things like that? Talk about what your offices are doing to be clean and protect against the virus.
Well, our office is, we're going to incorporate all of this social distancing and protective gear, especially with our drive-through location. It'll look kind of like a surgical outfit, I think, I'm afraid. And you hate to do that, but I have to protect my poll workers. So we're going to protect everybody using all of the recommended guidelines from the state and the CDC. In addition to this, those handling ballots will have gloves and other protections, but we're going to quarantine our ballots. We're planning to quarantine for about 24 hours. We want to make sure that any virus that might be on those ballots dies. Now, we get a lot of interesting stuff on our envelopes and ballots as it is, just without a pandemic. We've had ballots covered in blood, lots of coffee stains, just, kids' scribbles, all sorts of stuff. But we're going to be extra careful. We're going to quarantine these ballots. This brings up a challenge, and you may ask about this later, so hopefully I'm not stealing your thunder. If we're quarantined for 24 hours, that means that on election night, when we normally would have 80-90% of all ballots counted and reported on election night, it's not going to be that high. In fact, I suspect it'll probably be half. Almost half the ballots come in the day before or the day of election day. And so those who are really excited, looking for the results on election night and think that that's going to be final, they're going to have to be a little more patient. Having said that, even if it's just half, that's a fantastic statistical sample across the county and across the state. And so I don't expect the results to change dramatically. But if you've got a tight race, I wouldn't go to bed confident or dejected on election night, because things can change.
On top of that, typically we're allowed to release the first round of results at 8 p.m. And one of the things that the legislature changed is that first round of results, we can't even release that until 10 p.m. So half the people will want to be going to bed before we've even released the first round of results. And then, as Ricky said, with quarantine happening on ballots around the state, my guess is that we may not know who won a race, if it's a close race, until Friday.
And I'm going to be even less optimistic than that, actually. In some very close races recently, and I guess let me back up. In 2018, we had 27 of our 29 counties conducting their elections by mail. And although we are dropping a lot of results on election night, the last couple of cycles, close races have taken time to know who the winner is. I'm going to reference the 4th Congressional District again. With Mia Love and Ben McAdams, we really did not know the outcome until 2 weeks after the election because it was just that close. With some of our congressional races, this time with the governor's race where we have multiple candidates and perhaps some very tight numbers, it's very possible we don't know the outcome for 2 weeks. The canvass period has actually been extended. It's normally 2 weeks. It's going to be 3 weeks this time to accommodate for quarantining ballots and heaven forbid if we have to quarantine a staff anywhere. But people are going to need to be patient with the results this time. It's going to take some time. The expectation should be that we won't know final outcomes for a couple of weeks, and if it comes faster than that, great. But people are going to need to be patient here.
Yeah, as well as with processing, in my ballot center, typically we'll have 20 temp workers in there processing ballots on election day, so that we can get through ballots quickly. And that doesn't include my staff. So if we include my staff, my temp workers, plus my just election day workers, we're looking at minimum of 30 plus people are typically in the ballot center on election day. When you add poll watchers from the campaigns and media, we could have upwards of 40 people in our ballot center. But with the edict from the governor that we not have more than 20 people in close proximity, we're going to have to spread that out, and it's going to take us longer to process these ballots.
One of the other things we have seen in the last 2 major elections, for example, in 2018, we had nearly 100,000 ballots. Between those dropped in drop boxes and at the post office, we received on election day nearly 100,000 of a little over 400,000 of our ballots on election day. We have to go through and process those, verify all the signatures on those. And if that happens again, as it has for the last few elections, people tend to wait to drop their ballots. Happened in the presidential primary. We have to do the work of getting those processed, signatures verified. So we cannot possibly get those included in the election night results, all of those ballots dropped at that last minute. I mean, it just can't be done. So it's a good thing that we have this extra time, because as Amelia said, we're going to space our people in the ballot center. They have to be socially distanced. They're going to have masks, shields, sanitizer, all of that. And we won't be able to have as many of them working down in our ballot center as we normally would.
So I'm going to make the pitch. If you want results quickly, send your ballot in now. The longer you wait to send in the ballot, the longer it's going to take to get results.
Good point. One of the questions that's come in from our viewers is that the national debate really is about the difference between absentee vote by mail and universal vote by mail. So maybe we can delve into that a little bit. Who wants to really explain to those watching the difference of why the national debate may be a little bit different than we're experiencing here in Utah?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that your processes are a lot different. When you do expanded, absentee, no excuse vote by mail, as opposed to universal vote by mail. Ricky talked about it a little bit earlier. When you do expanded absentee vote by mail, you're not removing dead people from your rolls. You're not removing people that have moved from your rolls. I think the EAC, the Federal Elections Assistance Commission, they ran a report, I think it was earlier this year, that said that there are something like 7 million more registered voters in the country than there are eligible voters. And a lot of the reason that happens is because somebody moves. Maybe somebody moves from Utah County to Salt Lake County, or maybe they move from Utah County to Las Vegas. And if we're not doing vote by mail, we don't bother to take them off those lists, because when you move, you don't have a checklist that says contact my county clerk and let them know that I no longer need to be registered to vote there. Most people don't do that. Particularly college students don't do that. And I have 2 major universities in my county, and Sherry's got universities, and so does Ricky in his county. However, when you do vote by mail, we run our lists against the NCOA, which is the National Change of Address Database. And when you put in a change of address with the Postal Service, we're removing you from our rolls. If you don't do universal vote by mail, that's not happening. So that's part of it. Part of it is that our rolls are better. And so there's less chance for voter fraud because we don't send you a ballot if you don't live here and you're not eligible. The second thing, if you look in Georgia, I know last week Georgia had an election and they had, I know it was a little bit traumatic for me to watch 4 and 5 hour lines, and they were using the old vendor that Utah County had when we had 4 and 5 hour lines. So I was feeling for those folks in Georgia. This is just prior to me coming into office. This is the mess that I had to clean up. Well, one of the problems, if you read the story in the New York Times, they talk about how people would wait in line for like 4 hours. They'd get to the front of that line and they'd say, I need to vote. And they'd look up their voter registration and say, oh, I'm sorry, you were registered for absentee ballot. You can't vote. And the person would say, I've been in line for 4 hours and I never got my ballot in the mail. And they'd say, I'm sorry, you can't vote. So then they'd have to go to another line. A lot of that problem was caused because of this expanded absentee vote by mail. In Utah, we mail everybody a ballot. But if you don't get your ballot, or if your roommate thinks it was junk mail and throws it away, or you spill coffee all over it and you decide not to return it to us anyway, you can still show up at the polls and get a ballot. They don't have that with expanded absentee vote by mail. So you're disadvantaging the people that are signed up. So this is really voter suppression potential on that side. And it causes confusion for people. And on top of that, your processes aren't as secure. If you're doing expanded absentee vote by mail, you may not have an Agilis machine and 4 OPEX machines like we have in Utah County and these large scanners, because you're not equipped for it because the majority of your people aren't using it. So your processes aren't as tight and secure.
Great.
So anyone, some of these other states that are trying to do expanded absentee and other things, they're really where we were a decade ago. That's what we were doing. That's what all counties were doing. And we've moved so much further beyond that with counties doing this. This is how they run elections now. This is the norm. So from that perspective, we're in a much better place than the vast majority of states in the country.
But we're still getting ballots with blood on it, according to Mr. Hatch. So
I've seen some things. It's like, I think that's Mexican food, but just in case, wear gloves.
Well, one of the things too that we do when we get ballots returned as undeliverable, and we go through and update if someone is moved within Salt Lake County and we get an address where that voter can be sent then a new ballot during our process, we will update their address and send them a new ballot during our process. So, and as Amelia talked about the NCOA, the National Change of Address, we are running that constantly, getting ready and preparing for the election. That was such an important piece of getting ready to implement a vote by mail system. And when we first started with just a couple of small cities, not small, but Cottonwood Heights and West Jordan, but comparatively, it meant a lot to just make sure our addresses were as pristine and as clean as they could be to make sure that ballots got to people. And even if someone does get a ballot, if that individual has moved, the person at that address would have to know how to forge their signature, because sometimes it happens. They move and the ballot goes to the address where the person no longer lives. They would have to know how to forge that person's signature in order for that ballot to be voted. And it's a felony.
Well, one of the interesting things about vote by mail, in addition to all the great procedures you have in place to protect people's right to vote and also protect against fraud, is the impact on the political process. As someone who's been involved in campaigns, who's taught campaign courses, what's been interesting to me is how it has actually changed elections. For example, when I was running for office, I was always worried about the October surprise because most people voted on the day of election, or I was getting ready for my October surprise against my opponent because most people went, those days are over with because you've got several weeks leading to election day. And it's really tough to do an election, surprise. You can get, you may do a mailer when the ballots go out, but it's very different. And the second thing that's happened is that I used to have my volunteers or the campaign I was working on, they're the polling place because you want to make sure that the people you identify as your supporters. That still happens, but now you're having where every day candidates, as you know, are calling your offices to find out who voted, and then they're calling the people they know who are their supporters. So there's tracking that's going on. So you have that dynamic that you guys are dealing with, but also this one of the elements that's come to light. It's chasing voters after the election, which I think is an interesting dynamic that now occurs with mail-in balloting. And maybe I'll throw this open. Who would like to address that?
Well, I'll address that. We call it, it's got a name, vote harvesting. So we send out a cure letter to individuals if their signature didn't match. And during the canvassing period, and it happened in 2018 in the close contest for the 4th Congressional District, and even in some other contests, where then the candidates or the campaigns wanted to attain a list of those voters for which the signature didn't match that were sent that cure letter, so they could encourage them to sign that form, that affidavit on their cure letter and get it back in so their ballot could be counted.
So vote harvesting. So we'll have to, for those of you running campaigns, put that into your quiver of arrows that you better be doing that. So Justin, you're on top of what's happening legislative wise. So the laws that are in place now, are you expecting any changes in laws? And what can we expect in terms of laws that will be taking effect in November for voting?
So yeah, I think it's important that most of the measures we've talked about for the June 30th primary, the drive-through voting, the postmarking the ballot on election day, no registration at the polls on election day, none of those are in effect currently for the November general election. Those will all go away here in July, and we'll go back to what is normal for Utah. Now, there has been some discussion. One of the major things that's being discussed is postmarking on election day. Should that be permanent or not? We've had a few legislators bring that up and expect to hear some discussion about that over the next couple of months as we anticipate there may be more special legislative sessions. And then depending where things are at with the pandemic, there may be some follow-up discussion about do we need similar measures in November. Now, I think there's a fairly good consensus among the election officials in the state, the county clerks in our office, that the things that we're doing for June really could not be done on the mass scale that we would need for the number of voters we expect to turn out for the November election. We're going to need polling locations. We're going to need to accommodate people that way. Because as we all know, turnout for a general election, particularly in a presidential year, tends to be off the charts. So we're going to need to make sure that we have polling locations and have ways to deal with voters that way. But I think it's also important to note that as we've been doing this for several years, 90% of our voters vote by mail. They either put their ballot in the mail, or they take their vote by mail ballot and drop it off in a drop box, or they drop it off at the polling location. So for the vast majority of voters, nothing's different right now, and nothing will be different in November. But there are those voters that either need to register to vote, to update their addresses, people who just, for whatever reason, love to go to the polls, or need assistance. We have our ADA community that needs to use those machines, those accessible machines. So for most people, November is not going to feel much different than June. And honestly, June this year doesn't feel a whole lot different than March for the presidential primary. But we'll see if the legislature really ultimately makes any changes, depending where things are at.
Great. Well, we have some other questions from the audience. We appreciate that. Why has vote by mail been so politicized in the national discourse? Any thoughts on that? Because everything's been politicized in the national discourse. But anyone have any thoughts as to why vote by mail in particular?
I don't.
I think a lot of people do it because they don't understand the difference between universal vote by mail and expanded absentee. Expanded absentee vote by mail can be very controversial. It opens up a lot of area for fraud. It also opens up a lot of opportunity for voter suppression. Like the folks in Georgia who were absentee voters but didn't get their ballot but then couldn't vote at the polls. I mean, there's a lot of problems with it. And I think when they talk about vote by mail, they're not looking at universal vote by mail.
I also don't think they have ever seen a process like ours. I don't think they understand it. I'm hearing things like they don't have a secret ballot. They don't understand that we verify signatures on the ballot return envelope. They do not know our process, and they just think it's some bizarre thing where everyone sent a ballot and there's no security measures in place. They don't know our process. I think if they saw our process, they would think differently.
The other thing is the post office does not treat election mail like they treat other mail. They may be thinking that the post office treats election mail like they do any bulk mail or any business return mail. But the post office has an entire section of code that is dedicated just to election mail. And expanding that too quickly, I know that when I took office in 2019, my local post office had never been trained on vote by mail, and we had done vote by mail for 2 years at that point. I had to step in and let my post office know, you can't treat our ballots like bulk mail. They're not bulk mail. But no one had ever told them that. So once we informed the Postmaster General in Salt Lake, he sent training down, they trained Utah County post offices, and we don't have problems now. But if things aren't happening, it can cause problems, and I think that's why it's become politicized.
Interesting.
One final thing, and I'll put my conspiracy theorist hat on. I've been involved with election security at a national years now, and the Russians and the Chinese are laughing. They love to see discord. They love to foment argument, and they love to bring into question the democratic process that has served our country so well for a couple centuries. And we know, because we've seen it in federal courts, that they are just stirring the pot, mostly on social media, but they don't really care which side is right and which is wrong. They actually go on both sides. Their goal is to get us to fight each other, and especially to undermine our trust in the country's election.
And the media cares about hits, right? They look at readership. So they're going to take anything that's sensational and bring it. Ricky's absolutely right. You don't actually have to hack an election. You just have to convince people you did. 2016 is the perfect example of that. We don't have one record of a single vote being hacked in 2016, but people think it's common knowledge that the 2016 election was hacked, and it's because foreign actors took out social media ads. The irony of that is that what we were being told is that Russia took out a couple $100,000 in social media ads and swayed an election. Yet Michael Bloomberg spent $500 million on social media ads and could only get one single Democratic delegate. So I'm not convinced that the election was hacked. Well, it wasn't hacked. I'm not even convinced it was swayed. If Michael Bloomberg can spend $500 million and only get one Democratic delegate, but the media has convinced us it has because that's sensational. And the foreign actors have succeeded because they've convinced people it has. Vote by mail is no different.
Well, I think we have our next forum topic. Expand on that. Justin, did you want to add anything to this topic before we move on to the next question?
No, everything I was going to say, everyone else picked up, so I think I'm good.
Okay, because you're the political appointee in all this.
Don't remind me. They're all elected officials, though.
An interesting question. And this is actually a compliment, I think, to everyone on the panel. Is it possible for the states that do not currently have universal vote by mail to implement it by November? What kind of investments and changes would a state need to implement a vote by mail system in such a short amount of time? So obviously, you've convinced somebody that we're doing it right here in Utah. They want to see it in the rest of the country. Justin, your picture's up. You're the statewide officer.
Sure. This is a question that's come up a lot in the last couple of months. And I've done dozens of interviews, and answered this question. And every month that goes by, my confidence that someone could get this in place by November goes down. I think the best time to plan on doing vote by mail is 2 years ago. The next best time was probably a couple of months ago. And now we're getting very close to running out of time, I think, for anyone to make, at this point, significant changes for November. Now, I think there are a few things that other states could do. There are states that still do not have no-fault absentee. You have to have a reason to get an absentee ballot, and you have to provide a reason. I think that's an easy expansion that some states could make. Just say anybody can get an absentee ballot if they request it. Now, that being said, we have states like our neighbor in Nevada, who just ran a primary recently and went from about 5% vote by mail to almost all vote by mail. And they had long lines, they had struggles, because one of the things you have to understand, and Ricky and Sherry, and it wasn't Amelia at the time, but Utah County all went through this. The first year you do vote by mail, you will have long lines. It happened to every one of our counties the first year they did vote by mail. And some of it just comes from the voters need to get used to it. You're going to have a part of the population that will just show up to vote at the polls on election day with their by mail ballot in hand. They didn't lose it. They just want to come to the polls. So they will have that ballot in hand and still wait in that line with that ballot in hand, which they could be filling out while they're in line, but they don't. And then the next year that goes down. And some of that is voter education. Some of it's just a learning curve. People get used to it. People trust it. But to go all about vote by mail at this point, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult. And I think part of the question is what's the infrastructure? They talked about the Agilis machines, the OPEX machines, high-speed scanners. You need different equipment to efficiently do vote by mail than you do to run polling place elections. And so there's an expenditure you've got to make, capital expenditures we need, and then training that needs to happen as well. So could it be done? Yes. Can it be done really, really well by November across the country? I'm very hesitant to say that could be done. And the longer people wait to do that, the more impossible it becomes as well.
So last year, I had to completely redo our election system. I took office in January and we had a municipal election in August. So I had 8 months and I literally had to change everything about how Utah County did voting in general. The only thing we kept, the only piece of equipment we kept were the iPads, but we updated the software on our iPads. Everything else had to change. And I can tell you, it took all of 8 months to do it and to do it successfully and to do it well. And I think we've been recognized as having done so very successfully. It took us 8 months, but I can tell you, if you today have a large jurisdiction, so if you're a smaller jurisdiction, maybe you could successfully do it. But if you're looking at, we have 300,000 registered voters. If you have more than 100,000 registered voters and you decide you want an OPEX machine, you can't get one between now and November. They're sold. You can't get them between now and November. If you want a high-speed scanner, like I have here, and you can't get one before November. You could get a whole bunch of low-speed scanners, which is what Utah County used to use, which is why you didn't get results from Utah County for 2.5 weeks. But we had a scanner that you scanned 100 ballots per minute. Now I have ones that do 300 per minute. You might be able to get some that scan 100 per minute. So if you're a smaller county and you don't mind hand checking every signature, literally hand checking every signature, and you don't mind using low speed scanners, I think you could do it between now and November. It would take training and it would take more staff. You probably have to double your staff, but you could do it. One of the questions is about cost. For 300,000 registered voters here in Utah County, it cost me $2 million. That was just the machinery cost. $2 million, plus I had to increase my staff by about 50%. Can it be done? Yes. But there's the other thing that people aren't talking about, and that's your print vendor. You can't go down to Kinko's and say, okay, Kinko's, here's the deal. I need to send out 300,000 ballots. I need 30 different ballot styles. I need them to all drop in the mail within a 3-day period of time. And I need you to get 100% accuracy on that. They won't even be able to obtain the envelopes. We had to put in our envelope orders in January for the November election. And then we had to buy our paper for the November election. So, and these print vendors that do vote by mail, they can't just ramp up like this. It's a presidential year. In a presidential year, the vendors that are really good at vote by mail, they're running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week in a presidential year. And they have that print scheduled out. So once again, you can't just go to Kinko's. Well, if you look at those print vendors and say, well, why can't they just buy more machines and hire more people? Their machines, they couldn't get them between now and November. They're looking at like an 18-month lead time to get the special machines that print this. So printing is going to be harder. Getting envelopes, getting 300,000 envelopes. Actually, technically, you'd need 600,000 envelopes because we mail you one in an envelope and then we send you give you an envelope to mail it back. So you'd need 600,000 envelopes plus your ballots. It's a very complicated process. I think they're going to have a hard time finding a print vendor. Oh, sorry, my lights turned on. Once again, a small county, maybe, but a large county, you're going to have a hard time finding a print vendor. You're not going to be able to get the machines, and it's going to be really difficult.
Okay.
And that doesn't include all the list maintenance that they would need to do in preparation for a vote by mail program. And that takes a lot of staff and a lot of work and ongoing commitment to those NCOA changes. And that isn't done automatically. That's labor and work by the staff to get ready for a successful vote by mail program.
Well, I think you reassured everybody watching the last few minutes. Someone's asked a question: what is the future of voting? What do you see happening, either as an expansion of vote by mail or other things that may are on the horizon? What will you be talking about when you guys meet again next year in your clerk association discussion? And and I'm sure Justin will be there to participate also. What's the future of voting?
I have a big smile because Sherry and Ricky are going to hate my answer, but I use mobile voting for my overseas and my disabled population. I do that because I think that in 10 years, the population is going to demand more convenient ways of voting. They're going to demand that they can use their cell phone. They're going to say, if I can buy a home on my cell phone, if I can get a loan on my cell phone, and if I can do my banking on my cell phone, they're going to want it. But in order for that to happen, it has to be secure. We have to be able to provide assurance and securities. One reason I utilize mobile voting for my overseas citizens and for my disabled population is because that allows us, a small demographic, where we can do trials and we can do tests so that we can ensure that when the public demands online voting, we have the tests to make sure it's secure. And just so everybody knows, with my overseas and military members and my disabled population who use mobile voting, we do 100% audit. We do an end-to-end audit of 100% of those votes every time because we want to ensure their security. Because I believe in 10 years, people are going to demand that. And I want to make sure that we've had proper time to vet that.
Well, this is obviously another forum topic. Ricky, anything you want to, since you're the conspiracy guy, any thoughts about that? Voting by phone?
Actually, I was in Colorado in 2014 giving a presentation on this exact topic, and back then it was not even considered really, other than the country of Estonia, which they do their elections online. And someone said, "Do you think it'll ever happen?" I said, "I think in 5 to 10 years we'll have online voting. We'll have solutions that are secure, and I believe that that's probably going to happen. We've got several solutions out there that are pretty darn good. They're not perfect, and the bad guys are trying hard, and it brings the risk to a new level because instead of hacking by mail a single envelope, you're now looking at possibly millions of records that you can do. And so they're working hard on that. But like I said, in 2014, this is America. We've got the best and brightest, and I think eventually we'll get there.
Right. Justin, closing thoughts. You're the face of democracy in this state. So any closing thoughts of the future and where you think things are going?
I'm not sure I like that title. But, and so hopefully I'm not the face of democracy forever. It's scary. But no, I agree. I think we will get to a place where online voting is not only safe and secure, but trusted. I think that's the other hurdle that we've got to overcome here. Is even if we have a perfect system, the voters have to trust it. And as we talked about earlier, you have to hack a system. You just have to make people think you've hacked a system. So I absolutely think we will get to a place where the technology is there. And then I think the public and the perception will catch up to the technology. But I think we will get there. I think what Ricky said, I think we're still, 5-10 years away before people feel really comfortable with it, but I think we will get there, no question. As far as, in some ways, Utah's already in the future of mailing or of voting, where we're at with vote by mail, ahead of a lot of states and so many things we have in place. I think you're going to see a lot of the country catching up to where we're at, and we're going to keep finding ways to be ahead of them.
Well, thank you, everyone. Again, this has been a Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah Forum, Preserving Democracy in a Pandemic, a conversation with Utah's election officials. And I want to thank everyone who participated. Ricky Hatch, Weber County Clerk Auditor, Amelia Powers Gardner, Utah County Clerk Auditor, Justin Lee, the State Elections Director, and Sherry Swenson, the Salt Lake County Clerk. This has been a production of Hinckley Institute. I encourage the listeners to log on to Hinckley Institute for other forums. And again, the Hinckley Institute does a great job of incentivizing and promoting democracy in Utah and in the country, and encourage your participation in their programs. I want to thank the audience, and again, thank you, the panel, for what I have found a very interesting and illustrative example of why we do things so well here in Utah.